And welcome back. I'm Greg Seltz. This is The Drive Home. My next guest said this. Senator Bernie Sanders and Republican Ro Khanna recently introduced wealth tax bills in the Senate and the House. There's bad policy. There's unconstitutional policy. This is both. So welcome to Thomas Jipping, Senior Legal Fellow at the Meese Institute for the Rule of Law at Advancing American Freedom. Thomas, welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Well, this is one of those things, you know, I was just kind of setting this up in my discussion of the news. You know, we have this notion today that government is all encompassing, and if we would just be more benevolent and caring with government, everything would be wonderful. Statism is the way to go. And as long as you give us enough money, things will be fine. Well, then we also see all of the corruption, and we see all of those things. The founding fathers, I think, let's just start there. They would have said, we told you that's what would have happened if you suddenly started to see the government this way. So talk about this before we get into Bernie's solution.
Well, the founders of our country, in the Declaration of Independence, which is going to be 250 years old shortly, they said that when you start a new form of government, you have a foundation of principles, and then you organize the powers of government on that foundation. Well, the principles that they understood was that, government is the ultimate expression of fallen human nature. It's going to become oppressive and corrupt unless there are real limits that keep government power limited. And that's never going to change. And that's why the trend that you're talking about today is really turning our back on what the founders knew to be true and what has given us the kind of liberty that we've had all this time. And we have to get back to that and accept that for what it is and embrace the limits on government that our system of government is based on.
Well, I concur with that because I always teach it this way. I said, there are three institutions. The scripture talks about God creating the church and the family. Those were in the garden. They were in perfection. What happened, though, is human beings sinned. They rebelled, all these things. And then God actually institutes government later on in Genesis because it's his emergency organization. Because humans got so violent that he had to say this far and no farther. How many people think of, and then when Jesus says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's, he, in the New Testament, limits government to basically law and order and things of that nature. And this whole thing about, no, just give us your wealth and we'll take care of you from cradle to grave. So talk about this new wealth tax and what I call fair share economics. This, to me, is political greed, but they're passing it off as benevolence.
Well, the founders of our country has had a pretty antagonistic relationship with taxes. They had
Right.
that Tea Party up in Boston, and the founders were very, very wary of government's ability to tax because, and the Supreme Court had early on had this great line. It said the power to tax is the power to destroy. And so they put first of all, they distinguished between different kinds of taxes in the Constitution. There are excise taxes, which are taxes on transactions. There are duties, which are taxes on imports. And then there are direct taxes, which are taxes on people and on property. And that last category, they had some very specific rules that they put into the Constitution itself to make sure that that government could not go too far with taxing people and taxing property. And today, people like Bernie Sanders and Congressman Khanna, they specialize in trying to pit one group against another. They have the bogeyman of the rich, this kind of thing. But the tax on the wealth that they're talking about is a direct tax. It's exactly the kind of tax that the founders in the Constitution put strict limits on. The amazing thing is that both Sanders and Khanna took an oath to support the Constitution.
Right.
Their proposal ignores the rules, and we're going to get less wealth if we tax it. I mean, that's a kind of a rule of nature that isn't going to change. So you got bad policy that violates the Constitution.
Well, and on top of this, I would just love to have somebody ask a tough question to some of these guys, because I remember one time when President Obama was talking about it, and he couched it in, people need a hand up, and he was talking about how we're going to tax and taxing the rich. And finally someone said to him, yeah, but if you lower taxes, you'll actually bring in more money, and if you have more money, isn't that the point anyway? And I'll never forget his expression, because he was so angry that they asked that question. And he said, well, there are other rules besides just having enough money. And I thought, finally, so if this was all about even helping the poor, it'd probably be good if we could start to get it out there that they say wealth is inherently exploitative, right? That's how they get away with it. But taxing is inherently controlling, right? When they tax us, it's so that they can actually determine what we're going to do and what we're going to say ultimately. What do you think?
Well, when they use the word wealth, or they use the word, the rich, just remember, we're talking about how do they get and stay rich? They invest, they create jobs, they fuel the economy. This idea of taxing wealth, not income, and of course that too, we needed a special constitutional amendment to allow that. To tax wealth, that's to tax what you have, okay? Not what you are bringing in, but what you have. Their proposal to tax wealth, this is not a new idea. There's at least a dozen countries in the West who in the 90s tried wealth taxes, and every single one of them lost money. Every single one of them drove wealth and jobs and people out of their country. It has failed every single time. So again, it's bad policy, it's unconstitutional, and we know it doesn't work. So
I like
around,
Yeah, I like how you illustrated it too. You said, income taxes is like diverting a part of the stream, which, takes a little capacity away, but wealth taxes drains the whole reservoir, right?
Yeah, that you're referring to a piece that I and a colleague at Advancing American Freedom had in the Washington Times. And my colleague, Preston Brashers, actually came up with that image, which I found really useful. So you've got a reservoir full of water and an income tax, which means that you cut down on the flow of water coming in, but the water is still coming in. A wealth tax means you're bailing out the water that's already there, and ultimately you're going to drain the reservoir. I mean, this, you don't have to be an economist or some kind of egghead to understand these basics. It's really common sense, and it's not going to do what Bernie Sanders promises that it will do. And besides, the founders were very clear. It's an inalienable right. They talked about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the Constitution twice protects property, the right to own property. That was a fundamental right, and we've really lost the appreciation for that. And it has very much to do with how free we are. The more of our wealth, the more of our property government controls, the less free we are. And that's really the bottom line.
Yeah, and Bernie Sanders has to know this. This is where, see, as a young man, I especially even in city ministry, I remember thinking, their hearts are in the right place. It's just this policy worked out in a way that they didn't expect, et cetera, et cetera. But it can't be that anymore. There's too much data out there. You talk about what's going on in Europe. People have tried this over and over and over again. 120 million people have been killed by their regimes just to get ideologically on board with all this. We've seen it, and it destroys entrepreneurship. It destroys freedom. Then why do they keep following it? It's got to be something about it. It empowers them.
Well, that's the thing.
Talk about that.
The phrase you mentioned, their heart's in the right place, that's an aspiration. That's what we want to be true. The truth is their heart is in a different place.
Okay.
And he genuinely believes in destroying wealth, empowering government, having government determine who gets what. It's the same sort of mindset about the relationship between people and government that's behind socialism and even communism. He genuinely believes that government should have the power to dictate who gets what, who goes where, who has what, and that's just fundamentally different than the very basic principles that have given us unparalleled freedom for the last 250 years.
So here's my question, because, I remember when I was in New York, one of my movies I used to like to watch
A lot has changed in our country over the last 40-some years. But I think right now things are a little confused. I think the messages that our leaders are giving us about some of these things are a little bit all over the map. And I regret that, because this is a time when we need clarity about principles that will never change. James Madison said, if men were angels, no government would be necessary, and if angels governed men, no limits on government would be necessary.
Right.
He was right then, and it's right today. And so we need the right leadership to speak to these basic principles. I went to law school, took 2 courses in constitutional law, never had to read the Constitution. But when I finally, examined what we call the Federalist Papers, those were just essays that the founders wrote. They published them in newspapers so that as many citizens would understand the Constitution as possible. Wow. And they figured if you would understand it, you'd support it. And we need to somehow get back to that kind of a model of understanding what the fundamentals of our freedom are, what are the ingredients, understand that the purpose of government is to secure inalienable rights. It's not to make us happy or rich. And then to embrace and hold on to and to defend what will keep that in place. I think it was Andrew Jackson who said, the famous line, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. My office now is near across the street, actually, from the National Archives, and that is inscribed in one of the big statues in front of the building. And it's that eternal vigilance about what? About these fundamental principles. It's like my mom baked and cooked all the time, and I think of ingredients. What are the ingredients that go into this wonderful final product? You change the ingredients, and you're not going to get what you're trying to make. That we need to refresh our understanding of what the ingredients of the freedom that we have enjoyed thus far. What are those ingredients? Which ones are missing? Which ones are in the wrong, dose, so to speak? And get the recipe back to what it needs to be, or we will never recover what it is that recipe was designed to give us. It's not going to be whatever we want it to be. Yeah.
Yeah, let me just jump in, too, because I always say this. I talk about American exceptionalism all the time. And right away our kids are taught to just cringe from that. Oh, we think we're better. And I said, well, if we're better, then why do we teach these 2 principles? That you have rights because you're created by God. You have inalienable rights. That's the first thing. Okay, but we also taught that human beings were depraved. They were 100% sinful, and they actually believed that, and that was the 2 basic principles. I said, if America is so full of itself, why did the second principle be taught just as much? Because that's why they limited government. That's why they created a tripartite government. That's why they didn't want power in the government that was over your freedoms. And that's the kind of thing that our kids are being taught in school, that there's no such thing as sin. There's no such thing as brokenness today, and that the government can give you everything you need. And like you said, I think mom and pops they actually already understand these things. They don't need some PhD to teach them this. They just need a mom and pop paper in their newspaper that says, here's these freedoms, here's these principles. And they'll go, yeah, that's right. We agree with that. Right?
Well, my dad was a Christian school teacher. I went to Christian schools all the way through college, and big proponent of Christian education. But even if you send your kids to the public school, how many parents out there in either category know concretely what are your children being taught about this system of government that we live in, which we claim we support. We certainly want the freedom that it's always provided. What are your kids being taught about it? Find out. And if they're not being taught the right things, do what you can to change it, because ideas matter. That's what the founding of our country was about. It was about the fact that ideas matter. When Madison said that government is simply the ultimate expression of human nature, you referred to human nature as depraved. It is.
Yeah.
So what's government going to be unless we guard it carefully? Guardrails, limits, rules.
Right. Right.
Yep.
And that's why even free market, I would say the reason why I'm a free market guy is because it's a million people making a million decisions. It's a million sellers and a million buyers rather than one guy in Washington, D.C. determining the price, which can be corrupted much easier. Let me just say this last thing. I think we need to take back the narrative, but they always do bumper stickers better than we do. So they'll say things like politics of benevolence, and our kids will go, that's what I want to vote for. But what if it was called a politics of covetousness? Which is really what it is.
Well, I've worked in Washington almost 40 years, and half the communication in this town is through sentence fragments like that. But those things can be powerful, and certainly with social media and that kind of thing, on the one hand, there's more opportunities for good learning and for education. There's also opportunities to further mess up our understanding of this wonderful country that we live in. So, this is a system of what we call self-government. We govern ourselves, and that takes an awful lot of work. It takes vigilance. It takes, just like raising kids do. Kids don't raise themselves, and countries don't govern themselves. We have to do it. And the founders gave us the formula. They gave us the basic building blocks. What they built and the ingredients they used have not changed. We've just departed from them, and we ought to get back to them.
Well, folks, we need clarity, and that's why you need to read stuff that Thomas Jipping's written. Where can they go for more information and that clarity that they need?
Well, if you go to AdvancingAmericanFreedom.com, you'll see not only things that some of our scholars, including myself, have written. There's an entire freedom agenda of public policies there that are coordinated to advance exactly what we're talking about here. There's an awful lot of good stuff. I've got a lot of smart colleagues, and I think we're presenting ideas that really can help reclaim what's best in our country.
Thanks for the conversation. Keep up the great work. Take care.
Will do. Thanks for having me.
All right.